Ancus Marcius, the fourth king of Rome, was dead. He had been an incredibly popular monarch. By protecting and expanding Rome's influence in Latium, regaining the gods' favor by pious ruleship, and constructing the kingdom's second city of Ostia, Ancus had reached levels of fame close to that of Romulus, the founder of the city. The king had died of old age, the second monarch to do so, the first being Numa Pompilius. Ancus had left after him two sons that might have been seen as popular choices for the succession. The problem was that hereditary succession was not something that the Romans had used in their previous interregnums, which meant that one of these sons would have to gain the favor of the people and Senate to be voted into office. There was one other man that did not want any of the sons of Ancus as king. This man was the guardian of the royal children, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, or Lucumu as he had been previously known, and he coveted the throne for himself. Lucumu had emigrated to Rome with his wife from Tarquini. On the way to Rome, he had witnessed a religious omen that his wife had understood its meaning as being that Lucumu was to become king in the future. To get a good first impression in Rome, Lucumu, after settling down, sought an audience with the king. Having brought with him immense riches from his home of Tarquinium, Lucumu would at this audience give a large part of it to Ancus Marcius, the king of Rome. After this, he would also change his name to the aforementioned Lucius Tarquinius, or as history knows him, Tarquinius Priscus, meaning Tarquin the Elder. Tarquin changed his name to be seen as more Roman. He wanted to become an established public figure, and the name change would make that whole ordeal easier. Tarquin, being a wealthy man, was quick to garner attention in the city and quickly rose through the ranks of the aristocracy. After not too long, he had reached heights as far as the king's inner circle and would be given the position of guardian over the royal children. Tarquin most likely coveted the throne, knowing it was his destiny, but could probably never overthrow Ancus because of his popularity. While Ancus Marcius was alive, Tarquin would have to settle for being a close advisor of the king. But now the king was dead, and an opening for a power grab was presented to the power-hungry Tarquin. During the interregnum that followed Ancus's death, Tarquin was anxious and therefore wanted the election of a new king to happen as soon as possible, so no other rivals could present themselves. Still being the guardian of the royal children, he next sent them away on a hunting expedition that would last for a few days. During these days, Tarquin would lobby for support for being elected as the next monarch of the city. He would hold speeches where he would boast about his generosity to the community of Rome since he moved to the city. A generosity that, according to himself, had been even grander than that of the previous king. Next, he would argue that it was not out of the ordinary that a foreigner could be elected. Both Titus Tacius and Numa Pompilius had been Sabines, so why could not an Etruscan be elected too? He also explained that he was not much of a foreigner anymore anyways. At this point, he had spent more time as a public man in Rome than he had in Tarquini. More than so, his credentials were far surpassing anyone else's, having been one of Ancus's closest advisors and so forth. Tarquin's arguments were not unfounded, and many of the Romans agreed with his speeches. So many, in fact, that he would win the vote by overwhelming majority. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus was now the fifth king of Rome. Tarquin's kingship would mark a change in the Roman monarchy. He would be the first of the following kings that would rule as a populist, leaning on support from the people and lower classes to cement his power instead of the traditional way of using the established elite and aristocracy to govern the city. Many of the Greek tyrannic kings of the same time period were using the same method of populism to hoard power for themselves, taking it away from the aristocracy and relying on their popularity among the wider population to make it impossible for the old elite to overthrow them. This did not inherently mean that Tarquin was a hated tyrant. In many ways, the people would come to see him as a good king and leader, helping the masses and in doing so increasing the splendor of the city. but it was through this popularity among the masses of Rome that Tarquin would be able to increase his own power and lessen that of the Senate. Depending on the point of view, this could be seen as both positive or negative. The lower population, who never had a chance in the first place for political power or primacy, did not care that a king that was generous and helpful towards them was hoarding power. It was even a good thing for the ordinary citizen. The more power their king had, the better he could make their own life. For the aristocracy, on the other hand, who previously had more power amongst themselves and did not need a king's generosity for a good and stable life, Tarquin could be seen as a threat to their own primacy in the Roman society. One of the first things in line with this more populist way of ruling was that Tarquin increased the members of the Senate by 100. The Senate would now hold 200 persons, originally only having had 100 since the time of Romulus. With this increase of senators, the power each member held by himself would lessen. These new members were also from what was known as lesser families, most likely still wealthy but not part of the older aristocracy. These senators from the lesser families would of course always support the king in everything, owing their appointment to him. Tarquinius Priscus was, because of this ruling, always in control of at least half of the Senate, now being staffed with loyalists to himself. After this increase of the Senate, Tarquin added 2 Vestal Virgins to the established 4 ones in existence. With the growth of Rome, an increase in sacrifices had been performed by these sacred priestesses. 4 Vestals were no longer sufficient for the workload they now had to undertake, which is why the king added 2 more. Sadly though, the king would have to execute 1 Vestal during his reign for broken chastity. This Vestal, Pinaria was her name, as described in my video on the second king, Numa Pompilius, would be buried alive in an underground chamber to die from suffocation for having committed her treason against the gods and the kingdom. Tarquin, probably knowing that success in war would lead to more praise from the populace, would early in his reign lead a campaign against the Latin city of Appiolae. Tarquin would not lead this war unjustly though, as the Latins of Appiolae, who had a peace treaty with the previous Roman king Ancus, had now started raiding into Roman territory. They waived the peace treaty as annulled, because the Roman man who had signed it was no longer alive. Tarquin would march his army into the territory of Appiolae and ravage it with much success. The people of Appiolae would call for reinforcements from their other Latin neighbors. 2 pitched battles would be fought in the vicinity of Appiolae. The Romans would win both. Tarquin next began to besiege the enemy city, but quickly decided that an assault was the superior option. After having won the 2 previous battles, the Romans now had numerical superiority, so they quickly managed to take Appiolae by storm. Most soldiers on the Latin side were slaughtered in the assault of the city. The rest were taken as slaves along with their wives and children. Next, the Romans would raze the city, all the way down to its foundations. Thanks to the capture of Appiolae, Tarquin would now return to Rome with immense plunder, more than any Roman expected from one campaign. With these new riches, the king would construct the Circus Maximus, a chariot racing stadium. He told the patricians of the city to also construct raised wooden perimeter seatings for themselves. In the early stages of the stadium, the lower population of Rome would have no seats for themselves. Instead, they would have to stand or sit on the ground. Importing horses from Etruria, Tarquin would use the Circus Maximus to hold games grander than any one of his predecessors. The games would become a beloved annual institution and would be called the Roman Games. Crustumerium, a city having been taken all the way back during Romulus' reign, revolted during Tarquin's campaign against Appiolae. The people of Crustumerium were also Latins and had for some time now started to lean more and more towards their own people until finally, Probably because Rome had conducted so many military campaigns against the Latins lately, the entire city rose up in revolt. This revolt would begin what is now known as the Second Roman-Latin War. The leadership of the revolt would instantly understand their mistake when the entire Roman legion marched against them and no aid came from other Latin cities. Most likely because it had already been used up in the Roman Apulian War and because a lot of Latins were preparing to join in the recently begun raids on Roman territory from the city of Nomentum. Tarquinius did not even have to put up a siege of Crustumerium. Once the Romans arrived at the city gates, the people inside opened them, and their most honorable citizens met with Tarquin and delivered the city to him. The only thing they asked for was to be treated with clemency. Tarquin, always looking to boost his popularity, would be merciful. He would put no Latin to death and permit no looting of the city. He only banished the leaders of the revolt, and to prevent further uprisings he would leave Roman colonists in the city, increasing its ties to Rome. As stated earlier, the Latin city of Nomentum, which lay close to Crustumerium, had begun to conduct their own raids on Roman territory. They had sent robber bands filled with people from their own city to pillage Roman fields, and were awaiting reinforcements from other Latin towns to boost their numbers. Tarquin, being nearby after his resubjugation of Crustumerium, now took his legion and marched it to Nomentum. The Latins of Nomentum must have believed that the Romans would be occupied in retaking Crustumerium, because they were so shocked at the quick arrival of Roman forces to their city that they did not have time to plan any resistance. The aid from the other Latin cities had yet to arrive, and their own robber bands would have been no match for the now battle-hardened Roman legion. The population of the city came out and met the Roman army as suppliants. Tarquin was again merciful, as he had been with the Latins of Crustumerium, but the city would be put under Roman control. Another Latin city, this one called Culatia, and located south of the river Anio, would also try their fortune and began to conduct war on the Romans. Many engagements would be fought with the Roman army, but the Culatians would be the losers of all of them. So many Culatians would lose their lives or be wounded that they had to retreat back to their city. The leadership of the city would, as the Crustumerians and Nomentans, try to get assistance from other Latin towns, but once again these would be too slow to arrive. Tarquin would assault the city, and the Culatians, seeing no other option, would surrender to their enemy. This time, probably because he was getting annoyed with the Latin incursions into his territory, Tarquin would not be as lenient as before. The entire city of Culatia would be disarmed and be forced to pay war reparations. Their city would also be garrisoned by a contingent of the Roman legion, and the leadership of the city was given to Tarquin's nephew Agarius, called the Needy One, to be governed with absolute power. After having achieved leadership of Culatia, Agarius would instead be known as Culatinus, and all of his descendants would be given that same surname. Why did at this time Latin resistance to Roman power increase in such a rapid fashion? During the previous king, Ancus Marcius, many of the northwestern Latin cities had fallen to the power of Rome. Earlier, when Rome had just been a single city on the Tiber, it had not been a threat to Latin homogeny and independence. Rome itself was most likely seen as a Latin city, but the Romans saw themselves as more. During its existence, its power had grown, and in the aftermath of Ancus's victory over the Latins, Rome had now become a hegemon in northwestern Latium. The other Latin cities understood the threat this posed to their own sovereignty, which most likely led to the increased hostility between the two peoples. So far, though, the Latins were only a collection of cities that supported each other over their ethnic bonds, but this support had not been successful, as we have seen in the cases of Crustumerium, Nomentum and Culatia. Something bigger and stronger would be needed to stop the Roman war machine, because as it stood now, Latin city after Latin city were falling to the enemy. But up until now, the Romans had only responded to Latin aggression, but Tarquin would next take his army against the city of Corniculum, a Latin city that had not shown any aggression yet towards the Romans. This was exactly what was needed to strengthen Latin resistance to Roman power and bring other towns together against a now aggressive common Roman enemy. Tarquin marched with his legion towards Corniculum and ravaged their surrounding lands. The Roman king, after having had so much success in his campaigns thus far, probably did not want to end his war and therefore decided on his current course of action in attacking an as of yet neutral city. Success in war and the booty it provided was after all seen as strengthening legitimacy and continued support from the gods, something Tarquin needed in his office as king of Rome. The people of Corniculum, having been taken by surprise, could offer no resistance in the field to the Romans. Tarquin therefore camped outside their city and offered them to enter a treaty of friendship with Rome. What this meant in reality, though, was most likely a sort of vassal status to Roman power, something the people of Corniculum understood and therefore rejected the terms. They would bet on the strength of their walls and support from other Latin cities to win in the end. The Romans began a general assault on the city walls, but the Latins resisted bravely, inflicting many losses on the Romans. In the end, their resistance was for naught, being worn out by the labor of defense and having a big contingency of the city that wished to give up their sovereignty to the Romans because they saw no hope in their action. The defense faltered and the Romans broke through, leading to the capture of Corniculum. The bravest part of the city, who had wished for continued defense, were slaughtered in the storming of their home, while the cravens who had wished for surrender would survive and be sold into slavery by their enemies. Tarquin would decide to plunder the city and burn it to the ground, probably as a show of force for them having rejected his demands for a treaty. The capture and subsequent razing of Corniculum would be the last straw for the broader Latin population in Latium. Many cities would join in alliance to once and for all fight back against the Romans, who were now seen as the aggressor in the war. A joint Latin army with warriors from multiple cities was levied and marched into Roman-held territory. Once there, they pillaged and ravaged the land, taking much plunder and slaves in the process. Tarquin took his army and tried to force the enemy into a battle, but the Latins instead retreated back into their own lands. The Romans, having lost their chance for victory in battle, instead took their revenge by plundering the Latins' countryside. This situation would continue for some time, the Latins plundering the Roman lands and the Romans doing the same thing back to the Latins. It would go back and forth until the two armies finally met each other outside of Fidenae, where they would stand and fight. Many lives were lost on both sides, but in the end the Romans came out victorious, forcing the Latins to abandon their camp and retire back to their own cities once more. After having won a decisive battle, Tarquin would again march into his enemy's territory to offer, in his own words, treaties of friendship to the cities that had conducted war against him. These treatises, as stated earlier, was in reality a form of subjugation to Roman power, but explained in nicer words. The first city to surrender to Roman arms was Ficuela, next came Cameria, but after these two towns had been occupied, it seems that the rest of the Latins once again began to panic, believing that all of Latium would fall to Roman power without any pushback. The leaders of the Latin towns would hold a gathering in the city of Ferentium, where they voted to try once again to fight the Romans. Only this time they would call for aid from the Etruscans and Sabines too. The Sabines would quickly promise to start raiding into the Roman borderlands as soon as the Latin army began their campaign, but only some Etruscan cities, namely Clusium, Arretium, Volaterrae, Rusele, and Vetolia, promised to send forces, and only men that they did not need at home. The Latins, after having received the reinforcements promised from the Etruscan cities, marched once again into Roman territory, praying that this time their gods would grant them victory. At the same time, the Sabines began ravaging the borderlands that they had with Rome. Tarquin, as a response to this great threat, raised a large army, most likely the standard legion with extra auxiliaries on the side. The king decided to deal with the Latins first, so he led his army to their encampment and set up camp himself. At first, no side wanted to commit to an engagement, seeing the size and preparation the other side had taken respectively. This led to a stalemate where the Romans and Latin light troops would skirmish with each other, with no advance on either side. After a while, frustration and hatred built up amongst the men in the two armies. Slowly, more and more warriors would come out and fight in the skirmishes, without being ordered to do so. This continued until basically the two whole armies were fighting each other in an unplanned general engagement. The fight continued into the evening. Much bravery is said to have been shown by soldiers on both sides, but it seems like the Latin side believed their enemy had come out better than them when they saw the cheerful Romans camp for the night. The next day Tarquin led out his army and kept them in battle formation, but no enemy came out to meet them. The Romans looted the battlefield from the previous day and with great exultation encamped for the night once again, believing that the Latins had lost all spirit for continuing the war. In the following days, the Latin army would be reinforced with yet more Etruscan warriors. With this extra strength, they decided to commit to a pitched battle with the Romans once again. The two armies met and quickly the Roman left flank started faltering to Etruscan soldiers they were engaged with. Tarquin was at this time fighting with his cavalry in the right flank, but when he heard of this threat to his entire army, he led his contingent behind his army, then wheeling his troops to the right, charged into the Etruscan flank. The Roman infantry, witnessing the bravery of their king, regained their strength and pushed back against their enemy. The Etruscans, on the other hand, being the target of this cavalry charge, and now experiencing a more staunch infantry in front of them, broke. A great slaughter followed of the entire right wing of the enemy army, and a general rout followed from the other parts. Tarquin took his cavalry, ordered his infantry to follow in good order, and overtook the fleeing Latins to their camp, where he entered it without much trouble from the soldiers left to guard it. It was taken by such surprise that they could do nothing else than give up their situation. The retreating Latin army next showed up in their camp, but was taken by an ambush from the Roman cavalry. Some Latins, seeing their comrades being killed in their own camp, began running the other way, but were then instead met with the organized lines of the Roman infantry. The Latins who were not cut down by the Roman soldiers were crushed under the feet of their own countrymen as panic broke out among the surrounded army. Only a few Latins survived. They were taken as prisoners and sold into slavery. Their camp was looted by the soldiers who had just slaughtered their friends and comrades. After this decisive and complete victory, the Romans marched into Latin lands, but they did not have to go far. Soon after, envoys from the Latin towns and cities showed up, offering total capitulation to the Roman conqueror. Tarquin would again show his clemency and mercy. No Latin would be put to death, sold into slavery, or exiled from their lands. The cities not already having been occupied would stay independent and retain their traditional governments, but be forced into an alliance with the Romans. With this extra strength, forces outside of Latium would think twice before attacking this new great coalition. All the plunder and captives taken by the Latin soldiers during the war were also returned, but no other fines were to be paid. Tarquin would next take his army back to Rome and celebrate a well-deserved triumph. Tarquin would take a breather and stay in Rome for a while to govern it. One of his first acts after the war against the Latins was to give out grants of land around the Forum constructed by Romulus to be used for private building projects. Moreover, he would also himself build shops and porticos around the Forum, increasing its magnificence. Next, the king wanted to enclose the city in a stone wall, but during the early phases of construction and planning, the Romans were surprised by news that the Sabine army had managed to cross the river Anio without words of it having reached Rome. Tarquin must have known and been preparing for a campaign against the Sabines. They had, after all, been active in the borderlands, raiding the Roman countryside since their alliance with the Latins. Rome had also fought with the Sabines 3 times earlier during the reigns of Romulus, Tullus Hostilius and Ancus Marcius respectively, and Rome had won every time, so the Sabine threat was probably not taken as seriously as it should have been. But because of the surprising nature of the enemy's arrival, it now looked more dire than ever before. The Sabines, knowing that Tarquin would now take his army against them, had made preparations to not have the war be fought in their lands. They instead advanced towards the Romans, crossed the Anio and fought a battle. The battle that was fought was bloody and costly for both sides and lasted long into the night. As no one could gain the upper hand, they both encamped for the night and continuously stayed in their respective encampments over the next few days. Both the Romans and Sabines were too hurt to continue fighting, something the leaders on both sides understood, which led to both of them breaking camp and retreating back into their respective territories at the same time. Both the Sabines and Romans would use this breaking conflict to gather larger forces to lead into the upcoming engagements. Tarquin would use this time to reorganize the army, in specific the amount of mounted troops the legion possessed. Ancus, the previous king, had in his wars used the mounted troops to much success in his campaigns, and this success had followed in Tarquin's war with the Latins. This was probably why Tarquin decided to expand the cavalry section of the legion. Originally, he wanted to add new formations alongside the already existed free ones Romulus had created that had the name of the Ramnes, Titienes, and Luceres. These new formations would be distinguished by the current king's own name, but it was not to be. Romulus, before he had created the mounted troop formations, had consulted omens read by the augurs of the city. Therefore, when Tarquin wanted to create new formations, it is said that a distinguished augur by the name of Attius Navius explained that the king could do no such thing before he himself, just as Romulus had done, also had gotten consent from the omens. Tarquin became wrath at this notion against his authority as king and ridiculed the business of omens by trying to call out the augur's bluff. The king said that if Navius had this gift of prophecy, then he could give a clear answer if what the king was thinking about at this very moment would be possible. Navius, being undisturbed at the king's notion, took the auspices and replied that what the king was thinking about could be realized. The king then answered, "Very well, I was thinking that you could cut a whetstone in half with a razor." Tarquin, now probably looking incredibly smug, told his servants to fetch a whetstone and razor and give it to Navius. Clearly he would fail in his task, and then the king would never again have to go through the loathsome process of taking the auspices again, having proven them false. To the king's surprise, the distinguished augur Navius took the razor and sliced through the whetstone. Contrary to the king's wish, this whole ordeal led to increased importance of taking the auspices, and the respect of the priesthood of the augurs skyrocketed. Not only henceforth would the augurs have to be consulted before serious undertakings in peace and war. If the auspices did not show good omens, then matters of vital concern for the Roman Commonwealth could be postponed. As for Attius Navius, he would be employed as a counselor in the king's inner circle, and a bronze statue of him, with his head covered, and the original whetstone would also be placed in front of the Senate House, where this situation took place. Tarquin, because of this whole ordeal, would have to settle with increasing the size of the existing mounted troop formations instead of creating new ones in his own name. The size would be increased to 1,800 men, 600 in each formation. The recruits would be known as posterior or secondary knights. The Romans, with a reinforced army, advanced with new hopes against the Sabines. The Sabines had not been lazy though, and had also received reinforcements from nearby Etruscan cities. They had marched and encamped near Fidenae at the confluence of the Anio and Tiber rivers. The Sabines had built their camp on both sides of the Anio with a bridge constructed by rafts connecting the two sides. Thanks to this, they now controlled the northern and southern area of the river. Tarquin would take the Roman legion and build his camp upstream from the Sabines upon a strongly situated hill. Both sides having the zeal for war, but not the courage to commence a general batting, knowing of the enemy's newly collected strength, waited for the right moment instead of risking it all and losing. But Tarquin had made a plan that would give him victory. Tarquin had chosen to encamp upstream from the Sabine army for one important reason. He was going to use the river to his advantage in the coming conflict. The Romans constructed rafts of their own and filled them with dry stick, brushwood, pitch and sulfur. Next they waited for strong winds. Around the morning watch, Tarquin ordered the rafts to be set alight and released into the stream of the river. The burning rafts crashed into the Sabines' newly constructed bridge, and the flames quickly spread and engulfed the entire structure. The Sabines quickly scrambled and began trying to put out the flames. While they were occupied in this new undertaking, the Romans attacked the southern part of the enemy camp and gained possession of it without much trouble. At the same time, another contingent of the Roman army, who had crossed the river earlier in the morning, now attacked the northern part of the camp when they saw the bridge being engulfed in flame. The Sabines were unable to fight the Romans and the flames at the same time. Many of the warriors who were not slaughtered by Roman arms threw themselves into the river, drowning, being weighed down by their equipment, or perished in the flames trying to put them out. It is said that the gear of the dead enemy soldiers floated down the Anio into the Tiber, which took it to Rome. The population saw the Sabine equipment and understood victory had been won before any messenger from the legion could come back and spread the news. After having routed the Sabine army, Tarquin sent the plunder and prisoners back to Rome. He would also build a great bonfire from captured enemy equipment as an offering to the god Vulcan. Next, the Roman king would press his newly given advantage and march into Sabine territory. The Sabines, being beaten but not totally destroyed, would try their luck in another pitched battle, but it would not go their way. Once again the Romans had won the day, and the Sabines sued for peace. A truce of 6 years was decided upon. After having achieved victory in conflict with the Sabines, the Romans would receive a joint demand from the Etruscan cities that had sent support in the form of manpower to the Sabine army. The Etruscans wanted all of their prisoners of war that the Romans had taken to be returned without any payment. Tarquin would reject this demand, probably not wanting to be seen as weak. The Etruscans had at this point sent support to two of Rome's enemies in the recent conflicts, the Latins and the Sabines. Sending back these prisoners would basically send a message that the Etruscans could conduct proxy warfare against Rome without any consequences. Having been rejected in their demand, the Etruscans gathered an army and crossed the Tiber, setting up camp near Fidenae. Fidenae had at this point rebelled 2 times after its conquest by Romulus, once against Tullus Hostilius and the second against Ancus Marcius. The city would once again show its disloyalty and let the Etruscan army into the city to garrison it. Fidenae, one of the cities closest to Rome in proximity, had fallen to the enemy hands without any bloodshed. At this point winter was setting in, so the Romans could do nothing but wait for the coming spring. But this would prove positive for them. The Etruscans would let down their guard and send parts of their army home. They were not able to have it all stationed in one city. As spring arrived, Tarquin would call upon his new Latin allies and raise the Roman legion. This strengthened Roman army would be divided into 2 parts. He would lead the Roman legion into Etruscan territory, while the Latin allies would be put under the charge of Egerius, the king's nephew and leader of Colatia, to take back Fidenae. Egerius marched the Latin allies and set up camp close to Fidenae, but he did not take the necessary precautions and the encampment was left lightly guarded. The Etruscan garrison in Fidenae had recently been reinforced with more troops, and they now sallied out of the city and took the allied camp by surprise. Many soldiers on the Roman allied side were slain, but the army was not completely destroyed. The Roman legion under Tarquin fared better, for while Agarius had suffered his setbacks, his uncle had plundered the land surrounding the city of Veii, and when a joint Etruscan army had come to the city's support, he had crushed them decisively in battle. The victory was so absolute that the Romans kept ravaging the Etruscan countryside for the extent of the campaign season without any resistance, only returning home at the end of summer. This was not the end though, as Tarquin would continue the same incursions over the next 3 years, denying the city of Veii their own lands, leading to much loss of lives on the enemy side. When the land had been devastated to its utmost extent, Tarquin would move on with his army against the city of Caere, a flourishing and populous Etruscan city. The people of Caere mustered an army and led it out against the Romans, but after losing many men in the following battle, they had to retreat back to the safety of their city's wall. The Romans, now being in control of the area, ravaged the land for many days, only returning home when they physically could not carry more booty. The enemy garrison in Fidenae was still a thorn in Tarquin's side and a blow to his pride. He would therefore march his legion against them and try to succeed where his nephew had failed. The Etruscans would try their luck with another sally, but now being up against the veterans of the Roman legion, were pushed back into the city. Tarquin ordered an assault on the city's walls, and shortly after it was taken by storm. The Etruscan soldiers were taken as prisoners, but the Fidenaean traitors who had opened the gates to the enemy were publicly beheaded or sent into exile. Their possessions and lands would be distributed to Roman colonists. The Fidenaeans' third try at independence from Rome had failed. The war with the Etruscans had now been raging for 6 years, which meant that the truce that had been established with the Sabines were just about to expire. The Sabines wasted no time with their plans of revenge, and therefore offered Etruscans to march through their territory, where a Sabine army would join them as allies in their war with Rome. The Romans had gotten words of what was happening, so advanced towards the Sabine city of Eretum, where the Etruscan army had camped. The following battle that would take place between the Romans and the Etruscans was the biggest one to date between their two peoples, but it was wholly one-sided. The Romans would gain a glorious victory, for which both the Roman Senate and people decreed another triumph to King Tarquin. Almost the entire Etruscan army was slaughtered, with only a few surviving stragglers making it back to their respective home cities. After this massive defeat, and being under the threat of a following campaign into their territory by Roman arms, the Etruscans decided to sue for peace. The cities that had been in conflict with Rome would send their most honorable men to sit down with Tarquin and settle the terms. The Etruscans offered the complete surrender of their cities to the Roman monarch, and at the same time pleaded for mercy. Because Tarquin was after all part Etruscan himself of origin, the Roman king would answer them with this: "Hear now upon what fair terms I will put an end to the war and what favors I am granting you. I am not eager either to put any of the Etruscans to death, or to banish any from their country, or to punish any with the loss of their possessions. I impose no garrisons or tributes upon any of your cities, but permit each of them to enjoy its own laws and its ancient form of government. But in granting you this, I think I ought to obtain one thing from you in return for all that I am giving, and that is the sovereignty of your cities. Something that I shall possess even against your will as long as I am more powerful in arms, though I prefer to obtain it with your consent rather than without it. Inform your cities of this, and I promise to grant you an armistice till you return." The Etruscan ambassadors would depart and return after a few days carrying the insignias of sovereignty from their cities. These insignias were a crown of gold, an ivory throne, a scepter with an eagle perched on his head, a purple tunic decorated with gold, and an embroidered purple toga. They also brought 12 axes, one for each city that had fought against the Romans. In Etruria, a king would always be preceded by a lictor carrying an axe together with a bundle of rods. These were the axes and the rods now being offered to Tarquin. The Roman king, being politically savvy, did not immediately accept these offerings, but instead left it to the Senate and Roman people to decide whether he should accept them or not. They would, of course, unanimously approve. Tarquin had become incredibly popular for his victories in war. From here on, Tarquin would be wearing the golden crown and purple toga, holding the scepter and sitting on the throne, while 12 lictors would always attend his person holding the axes and the rods called the fasces. All these ornaments would be retained by the following successor kings and by the consuls in the Republic, although the consuls could only carry these insignia during a triumph decreed upon them by the Senate. As for the subjugated Etruscan cities, these were most likely not conquered or vassalized, but instead put under Roman influence, as anything more than this would have overextended Roman power. Even if the Sabines would have wished for it, the Romans had not forgotten that they had allowed Etruscan armies to march through their territory to strike at Rome. The Romans now wanted revenge for this injustice, and Tarquin would gladly give it to them, and so declared war on the Sabine peoples. The Sabines would not lay down on their backs though, and quickly mustered an army, advanced across the Anio and ravaged the surrounding lands. The Roman king responded quickly and took his lightest troops with him to find and destroy the enemy's foraging parties. Many Sabines died in the following skirmishes, and the loot they had acquired were returned to its rightful owners. Tarquin next camped close to the Sabines' encampment and laid in waiting for a few days until the rest of the legion and his Latin allies had arrived at the scene. Only after all his men had gathered did he assemble into the plains between the two camps, ready to give battle to his enemy. Tarquin had also sent a contingent of his army to the rear of the Sabine camp, planning to trap the enemy in an encirclement. The Sabines, who were equal in number to the Romans, advanced into the plains and gave battle. The following struggle was hard on both sides, until the other Roman party advanced into the Sabine rear. At this point, most Sabines understood all was lost and their army took to flight. During the rout, the Roman cavalry managed to kill more Sabines that had died in the battle itself. The Sabine camp, witnessing the disaster of their army, surrendered to the Romans, not wanting to be slaughtered themselves as well. The Sabine cities would after this engagement raise another army under a more experienced general. They believed the Romans had won the battle by way of deceit and that the might of their warriors could still win the overall war. Tarquin got word of the enemy's assembly of more forces, so he crossed the Anio. The two armies would once again meet and encamp near each other, but the new Sabine general was more cautious than his predecessor, deciding to wait for more reinforcements while sending out his cavalry to harass Roman foraging parties, denying them of their own land. Many small skirmishes would follow until Tarquin got frustrated with the situation and ordered repeated attacks on the Sabine encampment. The Sabines had picked a strong location to build their camp on though. It was located on a hill, which made it incredibly hard to take by assault. After many failed attempts, the Romans decided to stop with their folly and starve out the enemy instead. After a while, the standards in the Sabine camp became so low because of food shortages that they had to take advantage of a stormy night to escape and flee from their camp. Their escape was so shameful that they had to leave behind their logistical animals, personal effect, war material, and wounded men. The Romans, learning of their enemy's departure the next day, would enter the camp, loot it of its valuables, and bring the abandoned men back to Rome as prisoners. The war against the Sabines would continue for a wholly 5 years, during which no side could achieve supremacy. Skirmishes, raids and battles were continually taking place between the two enemies, but neither the Romans or Sabines could turn their tactical victories into strategic ones. To finally end the conflict once and for all, Tarquin raised an unusually big army for the times, consisting of his Roman legion, the Latin allies, and the newly subjugated Etruscan cities. He took this army to the location where the Sabines had encamped. The Sabines, also having a big army, had divided it into two camps. The Romans divided their forces too, but into 3 distinct camps. Tarquin commanded the Roman camp, his nephew Agarius, the Etruscan one, while a competent foreigner named Servius Tullius, who had gotten close to the royal family, was given the command of the Latin encampment. After both sides were ready, they assembled in front of each other. On the Roman side, the Romans were stationed on the left wing, the Etruscans on the right, and the Latins in the center. The following battle lasted the entire day and was hard fought, but the Romans, most likely because they had gathered such a large force, won the day, slaying many enemies and taking more as prisoners. After their victory, Tarquin seized the enemy's 2 camps, taking as much plunder as his army could carry. The Romans, now having no opposition, devastated the Sabine lands, only returning home as the summer drew to a close. With his return to Rome, Tarquin celebrated a further triumph, more than any previous king had done. In the following campaign season, Tarquin had made plans to advance and take the enemy Sabine cities by siege, as the enemy at this point had lost all manner of ways to raise another army. The Sabines, understanding the futility of further resistance and that it could only lead to destruction and slavery, instead sent ambassadors to Tarquin to deliver the cities to him and beg for lenient terms. Tarquin offered the Sabines the same terms as to the Etruscans he had subjugated, which in general was a treaty of friendship. They would have to support the Romans if they found themselves in future conflict with other peoples. After this, as a show of mercy, he also delivered all the Sabine prisoners back to their home cities without any ransom. Tarquin had now vanquished all surrounding threats. The Latins, Etruscans, and Sabines had been put into place and been forced into alliances. Rome stood supreme, safe from outside attacks and more powerful than ever before. Tarquin must have looked at his achievements with pride, and his subjects must have looked at him with awe. Back in Rome, the king would continue with his enthusiastic building projects. The stone wall that had had its construction interrupted by the 4th Sabine incursion into Roman territory now continued. It would protect those parts of the city that had yet been fortified. Moreover, Tarquin would also construct sewers that would drain the valleys in between the Roman hills from the water that usually collected itself there during floods. During his 2 wars with the Sabines, the king had also vowed to construct a temple in honor of Jupiter, the king of the gods. This temple Tarquin wanted to build on the Capitoline hill, but this hill was filled with many lesser shrines to different gods. Tarquin asked the augurs to take the auspices and see if the gods would give him leave to move these shrines so he could build his magnificent temple. The Roman priests, taking their religion extremely seriously, did not just take the auspices about if the whole bunch of shrines could be moved, but instead did the ceremony for each and every one of the altars. All of the omens they were given from the gods were positive to the relocation of the shrines, except for the ones about a shrine to Terminus, the god of boundaries, and one to Juventas, the goddess of rejuvenation. These 2 altars had to stay in their current position, and Tarquin, already having lost a quarrel with the augurs at this point, conceded to the will of the gods. The altars of Terminus and Juventas would therefore be included within the circuits of his new temple. Tarquin would lay the foundation of his temple, but time was against him and construction halted at the time of his death. In the future, this would come to be the biggest temple in the world, but as it stood currently, no one could have guessed of its coming splendor. During Tarquin's reign, a remarkable thing would come to happen. A young slave boy by the name of Servius Tullius was laying asleep in the city, when out of nothing his head burst into flame. Many people witnessed this event, and the noise and excitement were quickly spread to the king and queen of the city. Tarquin and his wife Tanaquil hurried to the spot of this happening. When a servant was just about to throw a bucket of water on the boy, the queen stopped him and declared to all present that no one was to disturb the child until he woke up of his own accord. Moments later he would do just that, Servius opened his eyes, and at the same moment the flames went out. Tanaquil, being a pious woman who had been present at the previous religious omens, took her husband aside and told him that this child was destined for greatness, and that the flames were the god's way of showing this. She told Tarquin that he had to take in the boy and raise him as a prince, so that his future glory would be connected to their family. Servius Tullius would therefore be raised as a prince by blood to the king. He would receive a royal education and grow up to become a great man. When Tarquin was looking for a son-in-law, he could find no better man than Servius, so he wed him to his daughter. There is an alternative story to the upbringing of Servius Tullius though. The historian Livy tells us that this other, more credible origin story began when the Romans, in their war against the Latins, took the town of Corniculum. Corniculum had a prince by the name of Servius Tullius, who would be killed in the assault of the city. His wife, who was pregnant, was recognized among the prisoners of war by the Roman queen, and as a tribute to her rank, she was allowed to live in the Roman palace. Here she would give birth to a son that would also be named Servius Tullius. This generous act led to a friendship between the Queen of Rome and the Princess of Corniculum. Servius would grow up in the palace and quickly made himself beloved and recognized as a person of importance, not only among the king's court but in the general populace as well. As stated earlier, he would be given positions of high command in the army, as when he commanded the Latin allies in Tarquin's final battle against the Sabines. So important would Servius Tullius become that he would even be allowed to wed the king's daughter. "38 years after Tarquin's ascension as Rome's monarch, trouble would begin to stir. The sons of Ancus Barcius had during all these years lived in Rome with resentment that their guardian had stolen the throne from them. They had until this time not done anything drastic, because hope still existed that they would inherit the throne after Tarquin's death. This hope had now been lost when it looked more and more likely that Servius Tullius would become the successor to the Roman kingship. The brothers hated the notion of being robbed twice from their destiny, first from an immigrant and second from a slave. It was an insult to the royal blood that the crown of Romulus, a son of a god, would fall and be held by a son of a slave. There was only one thing to do to save Rome and their destiny. They would kill the king and usurp the throne. These sons of Ancus had once earlier tried to stir up the population of Rome against the king. Attius Navius, the highly respected augur that Tarquin had quarreled against, had disappeared mysteriously one day, and Ancus' sons were quick to blame the king. The brothers made it to the forum, where they held a speech accusing the king of orchestrating the augur's disappearance. They also argued that Tarquin had never been worthy of the title of king. He was not only not Roman, but he did not even have a home country at all, as he was descended from Greek exiles. The boys managed to inflame the people in the forum, and when the king arrived to defend himself, he was almost thrown out of the city on the spot. Tarquin, with the help of Servius Tullius, would in the end come out on top though, making a powerful defense of his person and refuting all accusations, together with Tullius' great influence and love among the people, would lead to truth prevailing, and the scheming brothers had to leave the forum in disgrace. Ancus' sons, being desperate, would instead settle for a more straightforward approach to achieving their goals, and picked out two desperate shepherds to do the murderous deed for them. Armed with their farming tools, they went to the entrance of the king's court and started a fake fight between each other. Soon the two men were surrounded by the courtiers, watching interestedly and wanting to know what was occurring. The men's act continued, and they got louder and rougher with each other for every passing moment, until they finally caught the king's attention, and Tarquin summoned them before him to explain themselves. The shepherds kept shouting at each other until one of the king's lictors demanded that they would speak one at a time. Tarquin at this moment was standing in his courtroom between these two men. As one of the shepherds began to explain the reason for their brawl, the other one crept up behind the king, pulled out his axe and split Tarquin's skull in one blow. Leaving the weapon lodged in the king's head, the two men ran for the door and tried to make their escape. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the beloved fifth king of Rome, who had expanded her borders more than any previous monarch, built magnificent structures inside the city, and had been praised for his charity to his people, now laid on the floor of his palace, slowly bleeding out. The king had been killed in a conspiracy, the first Roman leader, but far from the last, to die in such a violent way.